The summer air in Charleston carried a thickness that stuck to the skin, the kind of salty humidity that never really left you. In July 1961, the naval base stood proud along the Cooper River, its shoreline lined with grey ships and white barracks glinting under the southern sun. The sound of boots on pavement, the rhythm of morning drills and the faint toll of the chapel bell painted the perfect picture of order and control. From the outside, everything seemed just as it should be. But within those disciplined walls, something sinister had already begun. For decades, what happened inside that base was buried under silence, sealed reports, missing files and men who would take their secrets to the grave. That is until January 2025, when a storm of truth began to gather once more in the quiet corners of the Charleston Police Department. Sarah Delaney was 28, sharp-minded and relentless in her curiosity. She wasn't a detective. She was an archivist, the kind of person who lived among forgotten files and dust-covered memories. On that grey morning, while scanning through decades-old military documents for a university partnership project, a mislabeled folder caught her eye. It bore the seal of the Department of the Navy, but its contents didn't match its classification. Inside lay brittle, yellowed photographs of a chapel service, handwritten memos dated August 1961, and a coroner's report that appeared to have been signed, then scribbled out. Above the faded seal was a single word stamped in red: withheld. Her first instinct was curiosity, the kind that tightens in your stomach and makes your hands tremble just slightly. She lifted one sheet carefully and recognized the name that would soon unsettle the entire naval community: Chaplain Thomas E. Ward. The report described him as decorated, beloved by servicemen, and morally exemplary. But attached to the same report were files from the Charleston County Coroner's Office describing the death of a young nurse stationed at the base, Sir Evelyn Ross, age 24. The official cause of death, drowning, but the secondary note in faint pencil said otherwise: bruising inconsistent with accidental fall. Sarah pushed back her chair, staring at the stack. Something was wrong. If this case was truly closed, why did so many of the attached documents carry classification codes meant for active investigations? She knew she shouldn't dig further, but she couldn't help herself. Later that afternoon, she brought the file to her supervisor, Detective Mark Hanlon, a veteran of the force with 30 years of cold cases behind him. He was skeptical at first. "Records from that era are messy," he said. "Half of what you find in those boxes is rumor turned paperwork." But when he glanced at the coroner's annotations, his face shifted from boredom to concern. "Where did you find this?" he asked quietly. "Box labeled 14B, Human Resources, 1961, Base Personnel. Misplaced under recruitment records," Sarah replied. He stood up, retrieving an old map pinned on his office wall. "The North Naval Base Chapel," he muttered, tracing a finger along the airstrip access road. "That's the last place Evelyn Ross was seen alive." They agreed to reopen the archive as a research inquiry, under the radar. 2 days later, Sarah discovered an audio reel dated August 17, 1961, 3 days after Ross's reported drowning. The reel had no label other than service recording. When restored, a congregation hymn filled the speakers, followed by the clear, calm voice of Chaplain Ward, his southern drawl gentle and resonant as he delivered his sermon on repentance. But midway through the tape, there was a muffled commotion, whispers, footsteps, and the sound of something wooden collapsing. Then, abruptly, Ward's voice broke off. Hanlon rewound the reel again and again. "Listen," he said, lowering the volume. Beneath the static, another male voice could be heard, faint, anxious, saying something close to "she's still there." The phrase repeated before the tape clicked to silence. By nightfall, Hanlon had requested access to the old military police logs. To his surprise, most daily reports for August 1961 were intact, except for 2 consecutive days, the 14th and 15th, erased from the roll entirely. No accidents, no disturbances, nothing. As if those 48 hours had been wiped from history. Sarah couldn't sleep. The voice on the tape looped in her mind. She started visiting the base chapel herself, now long decommissioned and used for storage by the Navy Museum. Inside, the air smelled of dust and dry wood. The pews stood in uneven rows beneath stained glass windows, depicting war angels and soldiers kneeling in prayer. The altar remained untouched, its white cloth yellowed with age. And behind it, a small wooden door painted the same color as the wall. When she tugged it open, a narrow staircase spiraled downward into the dark. She hesitated but descended with her phone's flashlight cutting through the thick shadows. At the bottom, she found a narrow subfloor space that had clearly not been disturbed in decades. Crates, hymn books, and rusted lanterns lay scattered. But one corner looked different, the dust disturbed, the wooden panels uneven. When she tapped one with her foot, a hollow thud answered back. What Sarah found beneath that plank would change everything about the story the Navy told the world for 64 years. It was a fragment of cloth, dark blue wool, the corner of a chaplain's uniform, still imprinted with a faded insignia, and beneath it, wrapped carefully in a deteriorated canvas, a set of rosary beads coated in residue that glinted faintly even under dust. She didn't tell Hanlon that night. She just stood there silent in the dim basement beneath a chapel that had long lost its prayers, the whispers of the past pressing in around her. Whatever happened in Charleston in 1961, someone had buried it deep. But now, after all these years, the truth was clawing its way back to the surface. When Detective Hanlon arrived at the old North Naval Base chapel the following morning, the light had already begun to shift through the cracked stained glass windows. Dust floated in the beams of sunlight that reached across the aisle, settling over long-forgotten benches. Sarah was waiting outside, her expression unreadable. She hadn't called anyone else. No forensic team, no backup, only Hanlon. It was instinct more than trust. He looked at her, noticing the faint tremor in her hands as she held a small cloth-wrapped object. "Tell me you didn't touch anything else," he said. His tone wasn't harsh, but worried. "I didn't move it," Sarah replied softly. "I only uncovered this section." The floorboard was loose. Hanlon took a deep breath before stepping inside. The chapel had the uneasy quiet of a place once sacred, now uncertain of its purpose. Every footstep echoed like a question left unanswered. Sarah led him to the narrow staircase behind the altar, the same one she'd descended the night before. It was colder down there, damp, heavy air pressing against their lungs. When they reached the bottom, Hanlon knelt beside the disturbed plank. She pointed to the small indentation where the fabric and beads had been found. He slipped on nitrile gloves and lifted the wooden panel fully this time. Beneath it, the cavity expanded deeper than expected, a space large enough to conceal something more than relics. Inside lay another object, still partially embedded in soil, a rusted metal badge, the shape barely recognizable. He brushed away the dirt and a single word emerged from the corroded surface. "Chaplain." Hanlon exhaled slowly. "You realize what this means?" he said, glancing at Sarah. "If this belonged to Ward, it ties the chapel directly to whatever happened to Evelyn Ross." Sarah's pulse quickened. "But why hide it? Why here?" Hanlon's gaze lingered on the space below. "Because someone wanted this place to look untouched. Whoever buried these pieces didn't expect anyone to come looking 60 years later. They documented everything carefully, snapping photos under the faint light from Sarah's phone. Every click of the shutter echoed softly through the basement corridor. Then something else caught Hanlon's attention. Faint scratches along the brick wall, almost like markings or initials carved long before. He ran his light across them and read out slowly, "ER, AUG 61. He stood still for a moment. "Evelyn Ross," he murmured. The discovery shifted the investigation from curiosity to urgency. They carried the evidence out discreetly, storing it in a secure locker, before submitting a quiet request to reopen the military case report under the state's cold case division. Within a week, bureaucratic chaos ensued. Internal calls from the Navy's Historical Preservation Office, followed by formal messages requesting clarification of purpose. It was clear they had uncovered something the military preferred to stay forgotten. 2 nights later, while reviewing the digital scans of the 1961 report, Sarah noticed something in the autopsy's marginal notes. A sequence of letters had been written faintly in the corner, CHW 17C. Searching internal archives revealed it wasn't a file number, it matched an old serial for a chapel housing unit, specifically reserved for visiting clergy quarters. Only one name had been listed for that location in 1961, Chaplain Thomas E. Ward. Hanlon and Sarah drove back to the grounds. Now fenced off, and awaiting redevelopment. The small building that once served as Ward's quarters still stood, its wooden porch half collapsed, ivy choking the facade. The windows were covered from inside with sheets of newspaper, dated 1962. "Do you believe in coincidences?" Sarah asked as Hanlon forced the lock. "Not in cases where the Navy's gone silent for 60 years, he replied. Inside, the house smelled of rot and salt. Papers were scattered on the floor, faded sermons, hymnal pages, and military correspondence. The furniture, though decayed, suggested a man of precision. Everything was arranged deliberately, aligned to invisible order. On the desk, beneath a cracked glass lamp, sat a letter never mailed. The envelope read simply, "To the commanding officer for confession." Hanlon slipped it into a bag and opened it under the SUV's dome light. The ink had bled from moisture, but the words were still readable. "There are things beneath his house that cannot be blessed. I have prayed for forgiveness, but the river will not carry her sins or mine away." The letter was signed, Thomas E. Ward. That single confession, though cryptic, ignited the firestorm. Local press caught wind of the reopened investigation when a Freedom of Information request surfaced through a military history forum online. Within days, journalists were camped outside the base perimeter, asking why a Navy chaplain's name was suddenly appearing in a homicide review. The flood came fast. Veterans who had served under Ward began offering fragments of memory, his charisma, his sermons on morality, the sudden disappearance of a nurse everyone had liked, a young woman always seen near the chapel before she moved north. But no one ever saw her again. One particularly old witness, a former naval mechanic named Harold Pierce, rang Hanlon's office late one evening after seeing Ward's photo on television. "I remember that man," he said, his voice frail but steady. "He used to walk the docks at night praying. One night he came to me, asked for tools, a hammer, some rope, said it was for repairs in the basement. I never thought to ask what kind." That statement lodged itself deep in Hanlon's mind. Repairs in the basement. August 1961. The same month Evelyn Ross died. Sarah's focus, meanwhile, turned to the recovered tape. Sound engineers worked for days to isolate the buried whisper beneath Ward's sermon. When clarity finally came, the words chilled even the most hardened. "Officer in the lab." The phrase wasn't "she's still there." It was two distinct sentences. "She's still there." The difference in pause changed everything. It wasn't someone alerting another. It was someone observing something lifeless. For the first time since the case began, Hanlon allowed himself to feel unease. "That tape isn't a record of worship," he said to Sarah. "It's a record of the moment everything went wrong." And yet, one question still loomed larger than all. If Ward had truly done it, where was he now? The answer would come from someone who had been waiting 64 years to tell it, someone who knew that forgiveness comes slow, even to a man of faith. The face of Chaplain Thomas E. Ward had once been featured on recruitment posters across naval bases in the early 1960s. With his calm blue eyes and reassuring smile, he embodied everything the military chapel stood for: faith, strength, and guidance. But when investigators began piecing together the fragments of his past, that image started to blur. Behind the sermons and medals was a series of quiet transfers, sealed recommendations, and disciplinary notes that had somehow escaped public record. In the months leading up to August 1961, Ward had been under mental evaluation following incidents of fatigue and spiritual exhaustion. That was the official phrasing provided in the Navy's internal memos, a vague, sanitized language often used when the truth was too uncomfortable to document. Sarah discovered it while digging through personnel reports, cross-referencing psychiatric notes with official chapel logs. The more she searched, the clearer it became. Ward's career had been unraveling long before anyone realized. Detective Hanlon leaned over her desk, his eyes narrowing on the signatures. 3 psychiatrists signed off in 2 months, he said. That's not evaluation. That's damage control. They requested follow-up interviews with surviving family members, but most were long gone. The only living relative they found was Ward's nephew, James Ward Jr., now 74 and living quietly outside Savannah, Georgia. He agreed to meet them reluctantly. When they arrived at his home, the frail old man opened the door with suspicion. His living room smelled of mildew and old tobacco. Stacks of unopened mail littered the floor. "Everyone wants to talk about Tom," he said after a long pause, "but no one really knew him." Hanlon placed the letter on the table, the one signed by Chaplain Ward himself. James trembled as he looked at it. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "In his old quarters," Sarah answered. "It was never mailed." James stared at the signature for a long while before he spoke again. Uncle Tom was meticulous. He believed confession could save any man, even him. But there were nights when he'd come home from base looking white as a sheet. Said someone had been watching him. Said there were things he couldn't speak of in God's house. Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Did he ever mention a woman named Evelyn Ross?" The old man's eyes flickered with recognition, not of memory but of something he'd tried to forget. "I saw her once," he said. "Pretty girl, always laughing. She worked nights at the base infirmary. Uncle Tom used to bring her along to Sunday preparations. Said she had a gentle heart and a steady hand. Then one day she was gone and he stopped preaching about redemption." He paused. "Started preaching about silence." Hanlon exchanged a look with Sarah. James continued, voice trembling from a mixture of age and something deeper. "When he was reassigned after the incident, he sent me a box, sermons, journals, a few photographs. I never opened it. Thought I'd be cursed with whatever had taken him. That box became their next lead." James led them to the attic, where he unearthed a trunk covered in dust and rope. Inside were dozens of Ward's handwritten sermons, pages stained with ink and sweat, written in a hand that started orderly and became frenzied as the months passed. The themes grew darker: guilt, temptation, forgiveness through suffering. And there, among the pages, was a single photograph. Ward standing beside Evelyn Ross outside the chapel, sunlight striking across their faces. They were smiling, not as chaplain and nurse, but as two people bound by something closer, something secret. Hanlon studied the image. "They were close," he said quietly. James nodded. She looked at him like she wanted to save him, but Tom, he looked like a man who'd already made peace with being lost. Back at the Charleston precinct, Sarah began compiling a psychological profile. Ward's documented stress coincided with his personal correspondence going missing in mid-1961. Letters to friends faded out. Sermons turned erratic. Even the regular attendance logs for Mass shifted abruptly. 3 consecutive services cancelled that August, replaced by vague memos labeled maintenance work. Hanlon's instincts told him what the paperwork wouldn't. Ward and Ross had an affair. A connection that would have destroyed his career if discovered in that era. But love alone didn't explain the bruises, the secrecy, or the burial beneath the chapel floor. Parallel to the investigation, the Navy's Public Affairs Office started pressuring civilian authorities to halt the inquiry. "For there's no benefit in dragging ancient history through modern headlines," one official said during a restrained conference call. "The chapel represents decades of honorable service." Hanlon listened in silence, then muttered under his breath, "and one unburied lie." Despite the resistance, Sarah found a key lead hidden in a forgotten copy of a 1962 Charleston Post article. The piece mentioned an unexplained reassignment of Chaplain Ward to a remote logistics post near Pensacola. No one had linked it to Ross's drowning because the death had been ruled accidental. But attached to the same page in library archives was a clipping, a small funeral notice printed 2 months later. Not for Evelyn Ross, but for Commander Joseph Harper, the officer who'd overseen her death report. The cause of death: a single car accident on a clear road. No witnesses. A pattern began to form, one too precise to ignore. By August 2025, investigators traced Ward's reassignment records to a single retirement form dated 1964, issued at Fort Jackson. It bore no signatures, only a hand-stamped seal marking his leave as administrative completion. What astonished Sarah most was the note on the bottom line: chaplain relocated out of state, residential monitoring, mental observation. She leaned closer to the screen, whispering, "He wasn't discharged. He was hidden." The next day they got a call from the Veterans Health Archive in Richmond. The file had been recently declassified for research. Ward's last known residence, a Church of Restoration facility in North Carolina, functioning as both a retreat and hospice for retired clergy. A simple, quiet place surrounded by pine trees and silence. Hanlon booked a flight that same afternoon. When they arrived, the head nurse guided them down a long, sterile corridor lined with faded crosses. Thomas Ward? She repeated softly. He's been here since 1973. He doesn't speak much anymore. Always in the garden at sunrise, hands full of soil. Says he's tending the roots of forgiveness. Outside, beneath a row of tall oaks, an old man in a chair watched the sky. His eyes were pale now, voice weak, but when Hanlon approached and said his name, he tilted his head and smiled, as if expecting them. I wondered, Ward said softly, how long it would take for her to be found. The silence that followed told them both. He knew exactly why they were there. The garden behind the Church of Restoration lay quiet under the late afternoon sun. Pines swayed slowly, and a soft breeze stirred the scent of soil and roses. Sitting near a pond, frail and stooped, was Chaplain Thomas E. Ward, the man whose name had haunted the Charleston investigation for months. The gentle sound of water rippling against stone was the only thing breaking the silence when Detective Mark Hanlon and Sarah Delaney approached. Ward looked up before they spoke, as if he already knew why they were there. His blue eyes were pale, tired, but still sharp enough to read the truth in their faces. You found her, he said softly. Yes, Sarah answered. We found what was left beneath the chapel floor. And your badge. Ward didn't ask for details. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the pond, as if the reflections might wash away what time had not. After a long pause, he said, Faith never forgets what it buries. Hanlon stepped closer. Chaplain, we're giving you a chance to tell it your way. Evelyn Ross, what happened to her? The old man smiled sadly. Evelyn, yes. She came to me after losing someone in the Atlantic. She volunteered at the infirmary to keep her mind steady. I was her chaplain, her counselor. But I became something else. We both did. His fingers trembled as they folded over one another. When you guide others toward forgiveness, sometimes you forget to ask it for yourself. Sarah watched silent. Ward's voice carried the weight of 6 decades of guilt. We met after evening mass, he continued. She stayed behind to clean the altar. I stayed to pray. At first it was just talk and faith, grief, purpose. Then it wasn't just talk. He took a slow breath, the words dragging out like confession. We met secretly in the basement, the storage space under the chapel. It was the only place nobody came. But secrets like that never stay buried long. His eyes hardened. By mid-August of 1961, someone had seen us. Evelyn was terrified. Word would ruin her, and me. Hanlon leaned forward. The night she died, you were there? Ward nodded faintly. She came to end it. Said we couldn't keep pretending. We argued. I don't even remember what about anymore, only that I wouldn't let her walk away angry. I tried to stop her. Grabbed her arm. She slipped. His eyes closed. The sound of her head hitting the pew. It's never stopped echoing. Sarah looked down, holding her breath. You buried her, she said. Under the altar, Ward whispered. There was canvas, old hymn cloths, a spade from maintenance. I wrapped her gently, prayed over her. I thought, maybe God would forgive a moment's weakness. His voice broke. Instead, he let me live with it. Hanlon's tone was low but steady. Why wasn't it reported as an accident? The coroner's file said drowning. Ward gave a weary laugh. The commander found me the next morning. He saw the blood, saw her. He told me it would destroy the base. A chaplain and a nurse in disgrace. They staged it by the water, told me to keep quiet. They even held a service for her, right above where she really was. He stared at his hands. I buried her twice that week. For a while, none of them spoke. Leaves rustled across the gravel. A faraway bell rang from the hospice wing. Finally, Sarah asked quietly, And they let you stay in the Navy? They needed an obedient sinner, he said. So they transferred me, then tucked me away here when I started writing letters to her family. I called it confession. They called it madness. Hanlon studied the frail man. You understand this will reopen a criminal case? The case was never closed, Ward muttered. They just stopped looking. He reached into the pocket of his blanket and drew out a single rosary bead tied to a strip of blue fabric. She tore her rosary that night. I kept this. Never prayed with it, though. It wasn't mine to use. Sarah's eyes filled despite herself. She deserves to be found, she said. She already has, Ward whispered. Then his hand went still. For a moment they thought he'd simply drifted off, but when the nurse rushed forward it was clear his pulse had faded. Thomas E. Ward died there in the garden, seated before the pond he'd tended for decades. No struggle, no smile. Just stillness. Days later, forensic teams returned to the North Naval Base chapel under full authority. Beneath warped planks, they uncovered decayed fabric, skeletal remains, and traces of the rosary beads Ward had described. DNA sequencing confirmed the truth. Evelyn Ross had been there all along. The Navy issued a statement calling it a historic tragedy, but locals in Charleston didn't buy the neutrality. For weeks, headlines carried the story. 1961 cold case solved, chaplain's secret exposed. Hanlon watched the media storm from his office window, exhausted. He waited 60 years to tell the truth, he said. Sarah nodded. And still, it only came when there was nothing left for him to lose. Outside, the storms of late summer gathered again over the harbor, the grey waters of Charleston rippling under the wind. The base had changed, the city had grown, but somewhere underneath it all, the echoes of that chapel still lingered. The memory of a love hidden, a life lost, and a confession whispered too late to save either soul. By early September, Charleston's newspapers had turned the old naval case into a national story. Every headline carried Chaplain Ward's name, often paired with words like scandal, cover-up, and betrayal of faith. Television crews flocked to the base gate searching for answers, but most of the veterans who once served there refused to speak. Inside the Charleston Police Department, Sarah Delaney and Detective Hanlon sat in the quiet conference room, staring at the evidence board that now told the full story. Evelyn Ross's photograph was pinned at the center, her smile frozen in time, surrounded by decades of silence. She deserved more than this, Sarah said, voice flat but full of feeling. Hanlon nodded. She was erased by the institution that promised justice. We'll make sure her name stays right where it belongs, on the record. Their investigation now focused less on guilt and more on accountability. The Navy's archived memos, the missing autopsy pages, and the reassignment orders all pointed toward one man, Commander Joseph Harper, the officer who had altered Evelyn's cause of death. After Ward's confession, Harper's tampering was no longer a rumor. It was evidence of obstruction. The trouble was, Harper had died in 1962 in an alleged car accident. But something didn't sit right with Hanlon. Over black coffee and long nights, he and Sarah reviewed Harper's old files again. "Look at the accident details," Hanlon said. "No skid marks, impact on the driver's side, and no braking. It wasn't an accident. Someone silenced him," Sarah frowned. "To keep the cover-up intact?" "Exactly." Hanlon leaned back in his chair. "If Harper died right after sending Ward away, someone higher up made sure it stayed buried." Their suspicions grew when an anonymous email arrived at the precinct's general inbox. The message contained a scanned photograph, a group shot taken at the North Naval Base Chapel dedication in 1962. In the image stood senior Navy officers, a few civilians, and at the center Chaplain Thomas Ward. What unsettled Sarah wasn't Ward's tired expression. It was the faint blur behind him, a figure partially hidden in shadow, holding a file stamped restricted. Underneath the message was a single line. "Ask the archives who else was transferred that month." They tracked the lead to the Naval Research Historical Center, where a retired records clerk named Walter Sims agreed to speak under anonymity. Over a cup of tea in his modest home, Sims recalled being ordered to refile certain documents from the Charleston base in late 1961. "We got directives from Washington," he said. They weren't unusual for the era. Top-down control was common, but this one was different. Someone wanted that file gone fast and clean. "What file?" Sarah asked. Sims hesitated. "The personnel dossier labeled RH-17. It contained names of all staff involved in the chapel operations, priests, secretaries, even maintenance workers. When I checked it, something stood out. Ward wasn't the only chaplain assigned that year." Hanlon leaned in. "What do you mean?" "There was a visiting chaplain from D.C., name of Leonard Pierce. He arrived at the base just a month before Evelyn Ross's death, then vanished from the Navy registry right after. The name triggered something. Sarah opened her database notes, scrolling back to the mechanic who'd spoken to Hanlon. Harold Pierce. "Wait," she whispered. "The mechanic who loaned Ward the tools. Pierce. He said the chaplain asked for rope and a hammer. What if they were related?" Hanlon's expression hardened. If Leonard Pierce helped cover it up, the Navy buried two lies, Not one. They followed the trail through scattered archives and veteran records until a church registry in Maryland provided the answer. Leonard J. Pierce had left service in 1965 and founded a local ministry, one funded under the Navy's Chaplain Outreach Initiative. He died in 1984, buried with honors. "That's our link," Hanlon said. "They used him to clean up the Charleston chapel and sanctify the burial. A spiritual cover for a criminal act." When Sarah presented these findings to the press board, the reaction was immediate. Within days, a congressional inquiry assembled a special task force to review military cover-ups related to base fatalities from that era. Charleston's cold case had reopened a national wound. Veterans began coming forward, sharing accounts of misconduct silenced by hierarchy. Some remembered whispers about the chaplain's girl. Others recalled closed doors and threats from commanding officers. But amid the noise, Sarah found peace in small truths. Evelyn Ross was finally laid to rest in Magnolia Cemetery, under her own name, with full honors. Uniformed officers, nurses, and townspeople stood side by side beneath the bright Carolina sky as the chaplain from St. Michael's read a short prayer. "She served with kindness," he said simply. There were no embellishments, no speeches, only silence, the kind that carried meaning instead of secrecy. After the ceremony, Hanlon placed the recovered rosary bead on her headstone. "One story ends," he said quietly. 100 others begin. Weeks later, Sarah returned alone to the old naval chapel before it was fully restored. The doors creaked, the air smelled of salt and dust, and sunlight streamed through stained glass, painting patterns across the cracked wooden floor. She walked slowly down the aisle to where the altar had stood. The floorboards had been replaced, the space beneath filled with clean sand and new support beams. But in the silence, she could almost hear the faint echo of Ward's confession, regret, faith, and failure woven together. Her thoughts drifted to the people who chose silence over truth, not out of evil, but fear. In their attempt to preserve the institution, they destroyed lives and left ghosts that haunted generations. Yet as she stood there, she realized that uncovering the truth had done something more powerful than punishment. It had restored memory. Real justice meant acknowledgement. Outside, waves from the harbor hit the shore, steady and rhythmic, as if washing over the city's unhealed scars. Charleston moved forward, but for Sarah and Hanlon, the case had changed them. They'd chased justice through decades of forgotten files, but what they found was more complicated. The burden of human weakness and the quiet resilience of those who seek the truth anyway. As dusk settled, Sarah locked the chapel door one final time. The sun dipped low, casting golden light against the river. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang, not in mourning, but as if blessing the end of something long unresolved. The ghosts of Charleston could finally rest. Autumn settled over Charleston with a soft grey calm. Tourists filled the cobblestone streets again, unaware that beneath their steps lay a story that had shaken the city's oldest military institution to its core. The Naval Base Chapel, once a forgotten relic, was now cordoned off for restoration under historical protection. To most, it was a headline already fading. To those who had lived the investigation, it was an open wound slowly healing. Sarah Delaney stood by the docks, wind tugging at her hair, watching the tide roll in. For months she'd worked to close the final documentation, transferring evidence, submitting transcripts, and preparing an official report on the Ward-Ross file. Yet despite the closure, something gnawed at her. Justice had been served in name only. The Navy admitted no liability. The cover-up shrugged off as a tragedy of another era. The truth had surfaced but left no one punished. No lesson formally learned. Detective Mark Hanlon joined her at the railing, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. "You look like you're waiting for something to happen," he said. Sarah took a sip, eyes on the horizon. "Maybe I am. I keep thinking of him, Ward, and how a single lie can survive longer than the people who told it." Hanlon nodded, the seawater glinting against his badge. Silence is powerful when you dress it as duty. He carried it so the rest could pretend the system worked. She turned to him. "Do you ever regret reopening this case?" "No," he said simply. "But I regret we didn't ask sooner. If someone had looked 10 years ago, he might have still been alive to face trial. The case had left scars." Hanlon, nearing retirement, bore the fatigue of a man who'd stared too long into the grey between law and morality. Sarah, younger but forever changed, felt the weight of history differently, as if she had fought a ghost and barely managed to hold her ground. In the following weeks, a journalist named Mia Brodie requested an interview for a long-form exposé about the case. Sarah hesitated, but eventually agreed, hoping that if the Navy refused accountability, the court of public opinion might do what institutions would not. They met at a small cafe overlooking the harbor. The journalist's recorder clicked as she leaned forward. "Did the confession change your view of faith?" Mia asked. Sarah thought for a moment. "I think it changed how I see guilt. Ward wasn't a monster. He was a man who made one terrible choice and died praying for forgiveness he couldn't find. But guilt doesn't belong only to him. Everyone who helped him hide it shares the blame, in silence, in obedience, in fear." Mia nodded, jotting notes quickly. "Do you think reconciliation is possible for the Navy after this?" "Only if they stop pretending stories like this don't happen," Sarah replied. "The past doesn't disappear just because it's uncomfortable. It lingers, like salt in the air." Later that night, alone in her apartment, Sarah sorted through her final binders. Tucked at the bottom of one folder, she found the original black-and-white photograph of Evelyn Ross and Chaplain Ward standing outside the chapel. They looked almost happy, a snapshot of two lives before everything went wrong. Sarah traced the edge of the photo gently, whispering, "You're remembered now." Across town, Hanlon sat in his dim office, the clock ticking past midnight. In front of him lay Ward's rosary bead, sealed in an evidence bag marked "Return pending authorization." He rolled it gently between his fingers, still inside the plastic. Dan thought about all the confessions he'd heard from the guilty. Drug dealers, thieves, murderers. None weighed on him quite like this one. Maybe because Ward had confessed not just a crime, but a system of silence that let it exist. He scribbled something on the back of a notepad. "The truth isn't loud. It waits until the room is quiet enough to be heard." By Thanksgiving, the report was published. News outlets revisited the case briefly, praising the perseverance of investigators who brought closure after 60 years. But beneath the acclaim, Sarah noticed what was missing. No mention of the Navy's internal failure, no accountability beyond sentiment. The institution had survived, like it always did. She visited Magnolia Cemetery one last time before winter. Evelyn Ross's grave sat beneath a spreading oak, her new headstone etched with both her name and service record, Nurse U.S. Navy, 1937-1961. Someone had left a single blue wildflower at its base. Sarah knelt, brushing leaves aside. "You deserved better," she said quietly. "But at least now they can't hide you." A sound of footsteps behind her made her glance up. It was Hanlon carrying 2 coffees again. They stood in silence for a moment, looking at the headstone together. "You think we'll ever stop finding stories like this?" he asked. Sarah shook her head. "No, but maybe now we'll listen when one whispers." As they walked back toward their cars, the sky began to darken, clouds stretching across the horizon like an old sheet drawn slowly over the city. The chapel would soon be restored, transformed into a museum exhibit, Faith and Service in America's Armed Forces. Sarah wondered if they'd dare include a small plaque about Evelyn. Probably not, but she would write one anyway, quietly without permission, and leave it hidden somewhere inside the walls when the renovations began. Months passed. Spring returned. The harbor air softened again and the city carried on. Yet at the edge of the naval grounds, near the rebuilt chapel steps, a tiny metal plate appeared, unsigned and unclaimed. It read, "For Evelyn Ross, whose truth found the light." Locals brought flowers. Tourists took pictures without knowing the story. And inside those walls, sunlight filtered through colored glass onto the new floor, where once the truth had been buried in the dark. Sometimes, Sarah thought, history doesn't change. It's quietly corrected. The city of Charleston exhaled. Spring sunlight filtered through Charleston's narrow streets, carrying a warmth that seemed to wash the last traces of the storm away. But some storms, Sarah knew, didn't really leave. They just quieted. Months after the Ward investigation closed, life had returned to a hum of normalcy, or appeared to. Beneath that calm, the reverberations of one man's confession still echoed through the Navy. Through the press, and quietly within everyone who had touched the case. The North Naval Chapel restoration was nearly complete. The front lawn bloomed again with azaleas, and the white steeple gleamed against the sky pure and new, as though time itself had been repainted. Yet behind every newly polished surface, Sarah could still feel the weight of what had been uncovered there. She wasn't sure if she'd call it redemption. Maybe remembrance was a better word. She stood outside the chapel gates with Detective Hanlon, now officially retired, his coat draped loosely over his arm. "Looks different, doesn't it?" he said. "Hard to believe it's the same place we dug through months ago." Sarah nodded. "It's cleaner, quieter, but I still hear echoes. It's like the walls remember. They both knew the case had left marks not easily erased, not on the buildings, not on the people. The government reports would go into archives. Journalists would chase new scandals, but for them this one would linger. It wasn't about guilt anymore. It was about how truth, once uncovered, refused to go back into the ground. Inside the chapel, workers dusted off pews and tested new lighting near the altar. Sarah walked down the aisle slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of the last remaining original pew. Beneath it decades ago had rested the secret that silenced an entire base. Now polished wood replaced rot, and light poured down freely from repaired stained glass. Ward's presence no longer felt heavy here, only distant, like a prayer fading with the wind. In her coat pocket she carried a folder, the final audit copy of the investigative summary. 57 pages of interviews, forensic notes and historical context. But tucked inside on the last page, she'd written a paragraph the official record would never include. History will not tell you what it cost a man to confess, or what it meant to a woman finally found. But I will. Their story is what makes faith bearable, the belief that truth, however delayed, still arrives. As she stood there, sunlight caught the exact spot where Ward had once delivered his sermons, his voice carrying through pews filled with men clinging to belief between battles. Sarah didn't see a monster. She saw a man who had failed, then carried his failure like a cross for 60 years. Somewhere between wrongdoing and remorse, Ward had found the courage to be human again. And maybe, she thought, that was its own form of salvation. She was lost in thought when Hanlon called from the doorway. "You going to sign it?" he asked. "Yeah," she said, slipping a pen from her bag. "It deserves to be finished." Her signature flowed across the page, neat, deliberate, final. She sealed the envelope and exhaled. Outside, a small crowd had gathered near the new plaque at the chapel entrance. The dedication ceremony wasn't grand, just a few veterans, locals, and historians. The Navy representative spoke briefly, careful as always, choosing words that praised reforms, restoration, and remembrance, without mention of how the story began. But when a local archivist read Evelyn Ross's name aloud, the crowd fell silent. For the first time in 64 years, her name was officially spoken inside the chapel. No applause followed, only respectful quiet. And to Sarah, that silence meant more than any speech could. After the ceremony, an elderly woman approached. She introduced herself as a distant cousin of Evelyn Ross. "I wanted to thank you," she said softly, eyes glistening, "for giving her back her name." Sarah smiled faintly. "All we did was listen," she replied. The story was always waiting. As the day turned to evening, Sarah and Hanlon walked along the edge of the river. Charleston's waterfront looked serene, fishing boats rocking gently, gulls circling lazily in the pink dusk light. The same river that had once been blamed for Evelyn's drowning now sparkled under the sunset, cleansed but still connected to everything that had happened. Hanlon broke the quiet. "If Ward were alive to see this, do you think it would have brought him peace?" Sarah considered. "Maybe, but I think it wasn't peace he needed. It was forgiveness, not from God, from himself." "That's harder to earn." Hanlon nodded slowly. "Are you sure you don't want to keep digging into cold cases? You've got the temperament for it." She smiled faintly. "Maybe one day, but for now I need to stop looking backward." The wind rustled through the marsh grass, carrying the faint smell of salt and pine. Behind them, the chapel bell rang once, a clean, steady sound that rolled across the harbor. Sarah paused, listening. "Funny," she said. "It doesn't sound haunted anymore." Hanlon gave a dry chuckle. "No. Sounds like it finally told the truth." They parted ways near the bridge, the sky deepening to violet. Sarah watched as the last light reflected off the water, shimmering like memories too stubborn to fade. Weeks later, Charleston's museum exhibit on faith and duty opened quietly to the public. Near the back, behind glass, sat a small typed excerpt from the Ward Ross file and a restored rosary bead under soft light. The plaque read, "Artifact recovered from North Naval Chapel, 2025. A reminder that duty and devotion mean little without truth." Visitors passed by, reading the inscription, unaware of how many sleepless nights it had taken to bring that single bead into the light, and in that, Sarah found her peace. Not in the institution's words or the public recognition, but in knowing that truth had outlasted silence. The chapel stood, its bell steady in the coastal wind, no longer a place of secrets, but of memory. Charleston, for the first time in decades, felt still. Spring melted fully into summer, and with it, Charleston seemed to breathe again. The investigation that had consumed the city for nearly a year was finally over. Reporters had moved on, officials spoke less cautiously, and what had once been a scandal now rested quietly among Charleston's long list of historical reckonings. Yet for Sarah Delaney and Mark Hanlon, the case had become something much deeper, not a headline, but a part of their own lives. The North Naval Chapel reopened at the start of June. The renovations had transformed it into a peaceful memorial space, blending its old soul with new light. The broken floorboards and dusty pews were gone. Sunlight streamed freely through polished glass, where shattered panes once dimmed the air. At the altar stood a bronze plaque with two names, Evelyn Roscoe's and Chaplain Thomas E. Ward. Beneath it, engraved in simple script, read, "For truth once buried cannot remain silent forever." Sarah stood near the back, watching the morning light fall across the floor. A choir rehearsed softly near the front, their harmonies carrying through the fresh air. It wasn't a public ceremony today, just a quiet reopening, but the calm suited her better. There was no need for speeches, only space to remember. Hanlon arrived a few minutes later, sleeves rolled, his hair grayer under the midsummer sun. "Couldn't resist one last look?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "I wanted to see how it feels when it's alive again." They sat in the third pew. Even in silence, the room carried layers of conversations from years past. The hum of Sunday services, the hushed confessions, the arguments that ended in tragedy. But the old tension had lifted. It was no longer a place where truths were hidden. It was a place that dared to exist with them. Hanlon rested his hands against the bench in front of him. "I read the official Navy statement this morning," he said. "They finalized their internal review. No more appeals, no further actions." Sarah nodded. "Of course not. You sound unsurprised." "The system rarely blames itself," she said softly. "But the truth's out there now. It's permanent. That's what matters." For a long moment they listened to the organ tuning in the distance, a low, haunting note filling the newly restored chapel. Hanlon glanced at her. "So what's next for you?" "You can't live in archives forever," Sarah exhaled, folding her hands. "I'm taking a post at Columbia University, teaching documentation and how stories are built and lost in records. Maybe I can help someone else find what others buried." He smiled. "Figures. Turning cold cases into classes." "You could guest lecture," she joked. "I don't look that good under fluorescent light," he replied. "Besides, I think I've got one more investigation left in me." "Another case?" He shrugged. "Old cases never rest. They just wait for someone stubborn enough to listen." The conversation faded as the choir began to sing again, voices rising softly toward the high ceiling. The melody echoed through the chapel, fragile, hopeful, pure. Sarah let the sound wash over her. She thought of Evelyn's laughter from old diaries, of Ward's guilt-torn writings, of the way the waves used to beat against the base docks the night everything went wrong. 64 years between then and now, an entire lifetime trapped between silence and confession. Somewhere, she hoped both souls had found peace. As they left the chapel, the sunlight outside was blinding. The city buzzed with the sound of summer, gulls overhead, boats knocking softly against the harbor, children laughing near the pier. Sarah paused at the gate, looking back one last time. "You think the city will forget?" she asked quietly. Hanlon shook his head. "Charleston never forgets," he said. "It just folds the truth into its stories and keeps telling them." They parted ways, Hanlon heading down toward the waterfront, while Sarah walked through the narrow streets toward Meeting Street. The bells from St. Michael's began to toll the hour, slow, resonant, familiar. For a moment, the sound carried her back to that first morning in the archives. The box marked "Withheld," the first glimpse of the truth she couldn't yet imagine. Now, it was finished. At sunset, she returned to the harbor one last time. The tide was rising fast, waves rolling over the old stone banks near the base. The air smelled of brine and magnolia, the same way it had the week she first reopened the case. Only now there was quiet inside her, the strange calm that comes when something broken has finally been set right. In the distance, the North Naval Chapel stood against the horizon, its steeple glowing soft yellow in the last light. For decades it had held a secret. Now it held a story, a told, recorded, remembered. The church bell struck once, the sound drifting out across the water. Sarah closed her eyes and let the sound fade. She thought of Evelyn, of Ward, of how easily the truth can be hidden, and how hard it is to bring it to light again. History wasn't just written in books or carved on walls. It lived in the choices people made when no one watched. As dusk fell over Charleston, the city's lights flickered to life, amber against the deep blue sky. Ships moved slowly out to the Atlantic, their lanterns glinting over dark water. Change came gently here like the tide, returning truth where it once sank. And as the waves reached the shore, the city was quiet once more, not with secrets, but with peace. For years, these cases were forgotten. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. Here we reopen the files, reveal the evidence, and give a voice to those who were silenced. Subscribe now and step inside the archive where time, lies, and justice finally meet. Because every secret eventually speaks.